I am about to turn the podium over to our distinguished flying visitor, Major Pedro Diaz-Lanz, who, as I have told you, was a former commander-in-chief of the Cuban Air Forces and a Castro supporter until he found out what Castro was doing and where he was headed. And he is going to undertake to moderate the next two speeches, so I have great honor in presenting to you Major Diaz-Lanz.
Thank you very much, Colonel Bunker, for your wonderful introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's for me a great honor, a privilege, not only being able to be here in this New England rally, but also to be in America. And believe me, I get plenty of reasons in saying that. For me, it has been more than a great encouragement being able to be here in this rally and meeting such a wonderful American patriots all gathering together. And I have so many words of encouragement. And believe me, after escape from our country, who was taken by the communists, I arrived to this land, to this beautiful country, America, with the intention first of alerting the American people about what was going on in Cuba. Then, after 5 long years of trying to liberate my own country, I got to the conclusion that the only way I would be able to free Cuba was in helping the American patriots in saving America, because those who are now in Washington in the key positions in the government were the greatest supporters of the international conspiracy and communism all over the world. And as a result of that, we weren't able to liberate our country. So I decided that first we must save this beautiful country, America, from a certain destruction which is in the way, and stop that thing. And then after we would have real American patriots in every position of the government of this nation, then we're going to be able to go back to Cuba and free our people. So in doing so, it has been going all over the country, in speaking and telling the people the story of how we help and cooperate for our own destruction through two main ways: inhibition or neutrality, through lack of information, and direct action through misinformation. And my friends, this is the story of how every country has been taken by the communists, including America. So this is a battle of information. Today I has been asked also in having the great honor and privilege in presenting two American patriots, which I learned so well to distinguish in between of those who by accident were born in this country and speak English, but they're not Americans because they're serving the international conspiracy, and those who really are Americans, those who are fighting to preserve the freedoms of this wonderful nation. So here, in this evening or this afternoon, I have the great honor and privilege in presenting to you Dr. Harold Lord Varney, President of the Committee of Pan-American Policy, a former political editor of American Mercury, former American advisor to the government of Chiang Kai-shek. This American patriot, we have a very important message for you. And of course, really, he didn't need my presentation because he's well known among you and well known by anyone who loves freedom all over the world. So here, in this moment with you, Dr. Harold Lord Varney. Does give you.
Major Lance, General Moran, and members of this splendid American audience, I feel it's a distinguished pleasure and honor to be able to participate in such a meeting as this. We're living today in America in an age of apathy, in an age of scorn, in an age of unbelief in the ideals that have made America great. And it's fitting on this 4th of July weekend that we come together from all parts of the United States, join our voices, join our brave and bold hearts in a declaration that at least this part of America has not yet lost faith in its own nation. Whenever I come to Boston, I always think of my old great-grandfather, who a long time ago was a member of the Massachusetts legislature from Sherborn. And you know the long steps that come down from the State House. They were there then as they are today. And on a snowy, icy February day, my great-grandfather walked down those steps and fell and broke his leg. As he lay there, fellow members and bystanders rushed to him to his relief. He looked up and he smiled and he says, "Well, I've broken my leg, but it's worthwhile being a member of the Massachusetts legislature." Well, that's the spirit of the old boys that made this country the great thing that it is today. And we're carrying on the torch that they put in our hands. And if we falter, if we weaken, if we show that we're no longer willing to make the sacrifices and face the risks that have made this nation what it is, then indeed the future of America is black and black indeed. And I see in the teach-ins and in the petitions of intellectuals and of a part of the clergy, I see in the crumbling spirit of bravery on the part of the youth of America signs that we are facing a decisive moment in American history, a moment that's going to prove whether we're men enough and women enough to go on with the America that great men handed down to us to fight for and preserve. Today, we face a problem in our own hemisphere, which is grave, dark, and to many of us inscrutable. You know, the United States has taken many a beating, mostly unnecessary beatings, but many a beating and many a humiliation in other continents of the world in the last few years. But we could be defeated. We could yield ground in Asia, in Africa, even in Berlin. And as long as we had our own hemisphere secure against the virus and the poison and the cancer of communism, there was still a refuge in which we could live and endure. And one of the great things that every American has borne as a crown of pride through the years is that with our Monroe Doctrine policy, we have had in America the determination that our part of the world, even though all the rest of the world crumbled, that our part of the world should remain in the hands of those who love liberty. And I remember a few years ago when a few audacious men, inspired by the Communist International, but calling themselves liberals, of course, seized control of the little country of Guatemala. Guatemala is, of course, a key country in the Caribbean. and the audacity of the planting of communism, of a communist regime in our own Caribbean, rose up against the conscience of the American people, and in a wave of determination, we took the steps. Fortunately, we had men in Washington who were bold enough and realistic enough to know what it meant. And we took the steps that drove that communist administration humiliatingly out of their domination of Guatemala. And many of us, in the face of that spectacle, I remember my old friend Eugene W. Castle, who in the last years of his life began to be very discouraged and disheartened about America. I remember he and I had luncheon together the day after our bench was driven out of Guatemala. And he says, that is the way to do it. At last, the State Department has shown that it has teeth. Well, we did that not so long ago. And then came Cuba. I'm not going to talk about Cuba today. Major Lodge and others in this audience can tell the story much more eloquently and much more poignantly than can I. But I want to say that the beginning of the present policy of utilitarianism in this hemisphere began with the moral collapse that the American people suffered when they permitted Fidel Castro to seize Cuba and to remain as the master of that unhappy country. It was a moral collapse because we didn't need to do it. There was no time in the early stages of the Castro advent that the United States didn't have the power to have crushed Castro like you'd crush the shell of an egg. We didn't use the power. Some palsy of the spirit, some cancer of the soul seemed to have seized the American public. And we sat there stunned, dazed, palsied, and permitted event by event to occur until Castro had consolidated a communist regime in our own hemisphere, in our own Caribbean Sea. And then we had another chance to get rid of it in the Bay of Pigs invasion. And oh, to the sorrow, to the shame of the American name, we walked out on those brave Cuban boys who went down there to risk and to offer their lives to liberate Cuba. And we set out our hands and allowed them to become prisoners and to lose the last good chance that we had to get rid of communism. And then came the missile crisis. And the missile crisis, God gave to the United States a second chance, something we don't very often have in history. A second chance to get rid of Castro. And all the circumstances were organized for the expulsion of Castro from the island. And I don't think Castro himself believed that he could survive that missile crisis. But Castro didn't know the weakness of some of the people who were deciding American policy in Washington. And after just 3 days, we lifted the blockade. We sent in that unclean creature, Yu Than, to decide what was to happen to Cuba and what America was to do about it. And you know the consequences. We made an agreement. It's not on paper. There's no document in the archives in Washington that we can resurrect to prove this point, but we all know it. We made a verbal agreement at a time when we could have taken Castro by the scruff of the neck and pulled him out of Cuba. We made an agreement that we would not attack Castro and that we would coexist with Castro, meaning that we would permit a communist government to remain unmolested at our doorstep, 90 miles from our Florida Keys. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that the American people have ever sunk to a depth of moral depravity as low as they sunk that time when they made that agreement with Fidel Castro. And they followed the agreement even worse, with instructions to the American Coast Guard to ring the island of Cuba and to prevent Cubans, patriotic Cubans who wanted to revolt, prevent them from approaching Cuba and landing and attacking Castro. In other words, we provided for Castro. We not only gave him immunity as a communist ruler of Cuba, we also provided him protection of American arms and of American force. How can we justify that in the great court of history that this age of American life has someday got to face? But today, we're facing other problems, and I'm going to briefly discuss them to you this afternoon and point them out and pinpoint them with the most merciless explicitness. Because after all, the habit of surrender becomes compulsive after a while. Once having yielded to the impulse to surrender instead of fighting, in the case of Castro, now we are manifesting in various parts of this hemisphere the inclination to do the same thing again in other places. With the missile settlement, the Monroe Doctrine was in ruins and in shambles before our feet. And communism, realizing that the United States wouldn't fight to uphold the Monroe Doctrine when they could win, decided they'd press their luck a little further. And they began reaching out. Castro began reaching out. Khrushchev began reaching out. Mao Zedong began reaching out to find the weak points in this hemisphere where communism could strike and could destroy. And the most obvious place, because it was a weak sister in the Caribbean, where they could strike, was the Dominican Republic. I'm going to try to tell you very briefly the story of what has really happened in the Dominican Republic, because you won't read it in the newspapers and in the slick magazines and in the speeches of Mr. McGeorge Bundy. I'm going to tell you what really happened in the Dominican Republic and the shameful role that the United States has played, not only in the immediate situation, but in all of the circumstances that led up to it. You remember a few years ago, the Dominican Republic was the rock-ribbed citadel of anti-communism in the Caribbean. It was a citadel of anti-communism because it was ruled by a strong, even though he was a bad man, Rafael Trujillo. Trujillo had his faults, and they were many and grievous. But he had one great virtue that we seem to have forgotten. He loved the United States. He'd been trained in the United States Marines. To the day of his death, he went down with trust and love for the United States, as few Latin American statesmen have ever shown. He realized that the Caribbean was an area that the United States had to keep clean from communism. And so, with his own resources, he set up an intelligence service, which is probably the most effective thing that we've ever had in dealing with communism in Latin America, to get information before the events occurred of what communists were planning and doing and getting ready to do in the various countries of that area. And as long as he remained the ruler of the Dominican Republic, Castro was stopped in his tracks when it came to expansion. He might try to expand in another direction, but Trujillo's Dominican Republic was a bolt that locked the Caribbean Sea against expansion of communism. And some of the wise men in Washington No use mentioning their names today. But some of the wise men in Washington decided that Trujillo was too evil for the United States to recognize and do business with. And we had to get rid of him. And since the Dominican people themselves showed no disposition to get rid of him, why, some great brains in Washington decided that we would spark a movement that would lead to the assassination of Trujillo. It was planned in Washington. It was executed by men who were in the pay of Washington. And one of those men, I'm going to tell you about it because you're going to come up later in this little picture I'm going to draw to you of the present situation in the Dominican Republic. One of those men was Mr. Antonio Imbert, who is now being supported by American funds to be the present ruler of the Dominican Republic. Mr. Imbert at this time was the hired murderer of the Trujillo regime. Any job that was too vile for any other man to undertake, an ordinary man to undertake, Mr. Imbert, for a price, was available to do the job. His hands are bloody with the blood of hundreds of Dominicans whom he exterminated when he was governor of one of the provinces and repelled an expedition which attempted to land. Mr. Imbert was an employee of Trujillo. He was on Trujillo's payroll up until the day that he helped to assassinate him. He was the manager of Trujillo's cement industry. He had grown rich and fat on the pickings that Trujillo had allowed to go to him. And the CIA got hold of this fellow. Now, I am not able to offer documentary evidence about the CIA. So I am going to say, I'm going to change that expression. I'm going to say that the story is that the CIA got hold of Mr. Imbert. Now, I'll tell you where I got the story. I got the story from a man by the name of Stanley Ross, who was editor of El Tiempo, a Spanish-language newspaper in New York, who has categorically made and published a statement, and I have no documents to prove it, that the CIA gave Imbert $400,000 of United States money to organize the assassination plot, which resulted in the death of Trujillo. And because Trujillo trusted him, why, he took the chances that led to his being destroyed. And that was the end of the Trujillo regime. And chaos fell upon the island. Nobody knew what was going to happen. After a little interval, a committee was set up of 7 men as a temporary committee to rule the Dominican Republic until the time came to hold a free election. And Mr. Imbert was made one of the members of that committee. He was given supervision over the police of the national police. He had supervision over the armories in Santo Domingo. And he was quite a man. He organized a political party of his own. And he chose as the executive secretary of his political party a man by the name of Hector Aristi. Do you know where Hector Aristi is today? He's the number 2 man in Camano's rebel forces, Camano's rebel communist government. Mr. Hector Aristi, the right-hand man of Imbert in his private political party, is today. And something happened. Mr. Imbert was struck with the virus of ambition. He decided that he should inherit the power of the dead Trujillo. And the way he saw getting the power at that time was to get the help of the communists to do it. Now, there happened to be 3 communist parties in the Dominican Republic. One of those parties, the PRD, was a priesthood type of communist party, the kind of a communist party that Betancourt runs in Venezuela under the name of the Acción Democrática, which calls itself anti-communist, but which advocates all of the things that communism is working for. That was headed by Mr. Bosch. There was another party called the June 14th Party, which was a Castroite party, and was subsidized by Castro, and was endeavoring to bring about a Castro regime in the Dominican Republic. And a third one called the MPD was controlled by communists who favored the Mao Zedong attitude toward communism. Mr. Imbert, while he was a member of the Council of Seven and in charge of the police department, proceeded then to shuttle arms into the hands of these communist groups and to arm them for a rebellion which he hoped was going to put Imbert into power in the Dominican Republic. And when I make these statements, I'm not making them on the authority of any right-wing publication. I'm quoting here now what I'm going to read to you. I'm quoting from the Washington Post, the arch-liberal daily newspaper of the United States. Mr. Imbert, during that period, before Bosch came to power, gave from the armories into the hands of these communist groups the armaments that they have used ever since in trying to foment and bring about a communist revolution in the Dominican Republic. And he did more than that. He gave money to these communist groups. Where he got the money, I don't know. Whether it came out of the Dominican Treasury or whether it was given to him by the Communist International, I don't know. But here's what the article that I am reading from says about that money. That according to Dominican exile youth who served as couriers in the Imbert operation, they took from the armories revolvers, rifles, and machine guns from in 1962 to be delivered to leaders of the June 14th movement, that is the Castro movement. These couriers reported having carried checks drawn on a Bank of Nova Scotia over the signature of Imbert and his secretary for $5,000 to $15,000 made out to the MPD and to the June 14th leaders. That is the man that the United States is maintaining in power today in the Dominican Republic as the head of the junta. Well, one thing about the leftists, they began fighting among themselves sometimes. Mr. Imbert's ambition was postponed a little bit because Warren Bosch, who belongs, as I said, to the Aprista school of communism, decided that he had a chance to get to the top himself. And so with the help of money that was given to him by Betancourt, who then was president of Venezuela, he organized a political party and he barnstormed all over the Dominican Republic and won the election and became president. And he lasted for just 7 months. During those 7 months, he tolerated and encouraged the communist movements and the extreme movements. He ran a regime so corrupt that his closest friend, his lifelong friend, was forced out of the cabinet because he was stealing so outrageously from the public funds. He was absolutely inefficient as an administrator. And at the end of 7 months, the people of the Dominican Republic were so completely fed up with him that when the army moved under the leadership of a brave anti-communist by the name of Weston and Weston, in 24 hours, Mr. Bosch was on the ship and sailing away to Puerto Rico from the Dominican Republic. And then followed another interregnum. An interregnum in which it seemed for a time as though there might be a conservative government, might evolve. And the man who seemed to be developing as a man who, when an honest election was held in the Dominican Republic, would probably win, was a man who was living as an exile, exiled by the State Department, my friends, by an exile in New York. His name was Joaquin Balaguer. He had been for a short time president of the Dominican Republic after the death of Trujillo. He is an honest man. I know him well. He came to New York without a dollar in his pocket. He had to borrow money to live in a cheap furnished room in a great Northern Hotel on 57th Street in New York. He's a man of high principle, and he's a man who is a stern anti-communist. And he organized a party in his absence. A party was organized that got the signatures of some 40 or 50,000 people in the Dominican Republic who were ready to support him in the election which had been slated for September. And the Boche people, the Boche communists, and the June 14th communists, and the MRD communists realized that they might lose their last chance if they allowed that election to take place. And that's why the revolt broke out. He was installed as the president of his part of the Dominican Republic. Mr. Camano's father was another of the butchers, side by side with Imbert, who did the rough stuff in the Trujillo regime. That's the kind of man that heads the rebels. His second in command, as I said, to Mr. Camano, was Mr. Ariste, who was Imbert's executive secretary in his own private political party. And then, for a few days, as you remember, there was much confusion. What was going to happen in the Dominican Republic? This communist revolt, which was aimed first to bring Bosch back from Puerto Rico, where he was being sheltered by Munoz Marin and his friends in Puerto Rico, this revolt seemed to be winning. It seemed to be growing because it was suddenly they had opened arms had been distributed to the criminal mob of the city of Santo Domingo, and it seemed difficult to stop it. President Johnson then did a courageous and a laudable thing. He was advised by two men, Thomas Mann, his top advisor on Latin American affairs, and Tip Bennett, the ambassador in the Dominican Republic, who is an anti-communist. They advised him that there were just 12 hours left in which the United States, by intervention, could save the Dominican Republic from coming into the hands of the communists. And the president, in spite of very much hot stirring in the White House and very much tut-tutting by his advisors, took the bit in his mouth and he ordered the Marines into the Dominican Republic and saved the Republic from that communist plot. And I'm sorry to say, although I admire President Johnson for being able to take that step, the tragedy of the situation is that the president is so surrounded by false advisors in the White House that he no sooner taken a step than he began a process of continuous retreat from the position of complete anti-communism which he enunciated in his statement to the public after he sent the Marines into the Dominican Republic. The man who was supposed to be handling American interests in the Dominican Republic was Tip Bennett. Well, Senator Humphrey, Vice President Humphrey, and a few of the people around Washington said, you must have somebody down there that knows the communists better than Bennett does, so we can find a common meeting ground. And they resurrected a man by the name of John Bartlow Martin. John Bartlow Martin is a former crime story writer who got into politics because he wrote a campaign biography of Adlai Stevenson. And he was sent down while Bosch was president because he was supposed to be such a good liberal. He was sent down by Kennedy to be the ambassador to the Dominican Republic. And while he was there, he went all out for Bosch. And he sent in the most favorable and most rose-colored dispatches to Washington about this great man, Bosch, who was resurrecting the Dominican Republic. And even up to the final revolution that expelled Bosch from the Republic, he was one of those who gave encouragement to that little group of ultra-liberal senators in Washington who wanted us to send American war vessels down there and reinstate Bosch by force. And of course he couldn't stay. He had to be recalled because he'd stepped out too far on the pro-Bosch limb. And he went into limbo. None of us heard anything about it. I don't know what he was doing. Suddenly somebody discovered this man John Batlow Martin is around, and he might do something for us. So President Johnson was persuaded in an evil hour to appoint John Batlow Martin as his personal representative, superseding the ambassador to go down to the Dominican Republic and try to find a settlement. And Mr. Martin arrived, and he did three things, one right after the other, that completely destroyed any hope of our having an anti-communist solution in the Republic. The first thing, he gave orders to the American troops who've been sent in there that they should not cooperate with the Dominican Standing Army, which was ready to move on the rebels and wipe them out. The Dominican Standing Army, led by Weston and Weston, was, with the help of the Marines, in a 48-hour operation, could have wiped out the whole rebellion, because it was weak and ill-led. Instead of that, Mr. Martin says, let's have a ceasefire and don't cooperate with the Dominican Army. Second, he hopped a plane and he rushed to Puerto Rico, and he desperately employed Juan Bosch to come back to the Dominican Republic and take the presidency. And he found Juan Bosch was in such a state of delusions of grandeur, and he began dictating terms under which he would return. He was so sure he was going to be brought back that he began dictating terms. He was asked to repudiate the communists. He refused point blank to do so. And the result was that Mr. Martin came back with his tail between his legs, having failed to get Bosch to cooperate with him in the plan that he had of easing him back into the presidency. And the third thing that he did was to look around to pick out another man to head the Dominican government instead of Bosch, who would be amenable to the things that he wanted. And the man he picked out, the man that he selected, was Antonio Imbert. The United States, with all of the high-minded men that there are in the Dominican Republic, when it picked out a man to solve and meet the crisis, went to this solid, bespattered relic of the worst features of Trujilloism, and placed him in power. And more than that, in order that Imbert would not be interfered with or weakened by the Dominican army and by Weston and Weston and his anti-communist group, the United States had a warship, the Boxer, in the waters of Santo Domingo. And 7 generals who were unacceptable to Imbert were invited to come on the vessel. They came on the vessel unawares of what was intended for them. They were seized as soon as they came on this American vessel and put on planes and sent to Puerto Rico, so that the army could be purged, so Mr. Imbert could rule the roost. And he's doing it today. Well, Washington still wasn't quite satisfied. That perhaps John Batlow Martin and his Imbert decision had perhaps made a mistake. And they had a second change of heart in Washington amid the prevailing fog of confusion. And they decided that no less a person than that supreme stuffed shirt, your neighbor McGeorge Bundy, if he was sent down there with his great intellect and his profound understanding, he would find a solution. And so Mr. Bundy left his labors at the White House and he journeyed to the Dominican Republic. And when he arrived there, he looked around and talked to the various factions, including Camano and the communists. And then he resurrected a pitiable figure who had been a member of the cabinet of Juan Bosch as Secretary of Agriculture, Minister of Agriculture. And Mr. Bundy put this man on a plane, brought him to Washington to be looked over by the State Department, and approved him as his choice to be the president of the provisional government of Cuba, of the Dominican Republic. And let me tell you that the man that they selected was a man who had connections with communism so deep and so profound that the act of Mr. Bundy was tantamount to putting a worse man than Bush into the presidency of that country. Well, it didn't work. I'll tell you why it didn't work. While I was still maneuvering, while Mr. Bundy was still putting over his grand strategy, why, some accountants got to work on the books of the Dominican Republic, and they discovered that there was a discrepancy of $800,000 in the accounts of this gentleman while he was Minister of Agriculture under Bush. In other words, after Bush, the communist, after Mbaye, the thug, they turned now to a man who is accused of being a bank absconder. And that's the third American choice to rule the Dominican Republic. And today, the situation stands very much in confusion. The great brains of Washington have acted, and every action that they have committed has led us into a lower depth of national stupidity. Today, the United States is self-proclaimed in the Latin American world as a country so incompetent to handle a simple police operation in a small country with only 2 million inhabitants that I can't see in the future the great, strong nations of South America ever having one iota of respect or of fear for any decision that the United States ever enunciates in the future. We have shielded ourselves under the name of the OAS. And the OAS got into the act. And they got out a proposal which also died a morning after it had been headlined by the New York Times as a solution of the thing. And you know what the OAS wanted to do? The OAS said that the solution for the situation in the Dominican Republic is to exile Weston and Weston, the principal anti-communists down there, and send in 70 experts. I imagine Betancourt would pick them out. Send in 70 experts from Latin American countries to take over and rule the country over the heads of the Dominicans. In other words, we, the great apostles of liberalism, we're going to take self-government away from the Dominican Republic and subject it to 70 experts from other Latin American countries. Well, that proposition didn't gel either. And that's where we stand today. And I maintain that the United States, in its blundering, in its feckless treatment of a situation that common sense should have taught us so easily how we could handle, has lost ground, has lost image in the eyes of the Latin American people that's going to be terrifically costly in the future of this country. We must, as Americans, realize that we have a State Department in Washington that has no policy for Latin America. We have a State Department that's following the policy of improvisation in every crisis that arises. What is needed in America today is a great recrudescence of public opinion to demand that the United States should have intelligent, anti-communist, winning policies in Latin America. And the touchstone of those policies should be, we should fight and work and win in Latin America for policies that will help the United States, because only by helping the United States are we ever able to help any other nation in the world. I thank you.